are joining us for what I believe is going to be an incredible adventure. Welcome to OT Panoramic. You know, every time we go on a trip somewhere, one of the things that we always bring with us is a camera. Maybe it's a big camera with a telephoto lens, or often when I travel, it's just my phone that we take pictures. It's not uncommon to pull up to an overlook like the one behind me, and everyone's got their cameras out taking pictures. Maybe your phone's like mine, and you can take a panoramic photo. You know, you hold your phone up at a vast landscape, and you hit the button, and you slide it across, and you get this beautiful panoramic picture. Well, what your phone is actually doing is taking a bunch of small snapshots and then stitching them together, and the end result is this beautiful panoramic picture of a vast landscape like the one behind me. We are doing the very same thing in OT Panoramic. We're going to go to 7 mountains throughout the story of the Old Testament, and we're going to climb up on top, and we're going to take some snapshots, pictures looking back in the story and pictures looking forward in the story, and we're going to stitch them together and get a panoramic picture of the storyline of the Old Testament. You know, the Old Testament for a lot of us can be challenging to read. It can be confusing. There's unfamiliar names, and there's places that we've never heard of before. There's rules and regulations that seem out of touch with a modern society. You read the Old Testament, and the books aren't even in chronological order. We read individual stories, and we struggle to figure out how do all these stories fit together. And all of that can lead to sometimes reading the Old Testament can just be a bit of a struggle. But I believe that if we can get up high and we can climb up on some mountains, and we can take snapshots, pictures looking forward and pictures looking back, and we can stitch them together and get this beautiful panoramic picture of the story of the Old Testament, we can help overcome some of that confusion, and we can regain the confidence to read the Old Testament well. But more than take pictures, we want to invite God to meet us on these 7 mountains. Mountains in the Old Testament were often a place of divine revelation. It was a place where God met men and women and changed and transformed their lives. And we want to go and invite God to do the same in our lives. This is going to be quite an adventure. I'm so glad that you joined us for OT Panoramic. To understand the story, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. I'll see you on our first mountain in just a moment.
As far back as history can tell us, human beings have wondered about our beginnings, the big questions of how and why we're here. The Bible doesn't give us every detail, but it does answer the most important question: who? This world was spoken into being by a loving God with a purpose and a plan, and He put us right in the middle of what He's doing. As the story unfolds, we find that love is the motivation behind this world. Because God's selfless, boundless love always aims at sharing and growing and bringing others in, God created human beings in His image, able to think and feel and share His Spirit, so we could relate to His thoughts and feelings, understand His ways, and love Him in return. He calls us to partner with Him, steward His gifts, fill the earth, and further His kingdom as far as we can. It's a beautiful story of a deep and fulfilling relationship. That relationship turned tragic when the first humans made a decision not to trust God's goodness and disobeyed what He had told them. We can understand that. At some point, we have all chosen to take life into our own hands, follow our own vision, write our own story, and do our own thing. Sometimes we do that even while believing in God, but holding Him at a distance in our hearts. The story of Adam and Eve's temptation and fall paints that picture for us and sets a precedent. We have all followed their lead. The image of God in us was distorted. Our relationship with Him was altered forever. The first couple was exiled from the paradise of Eden. Death entered this world, and humanity was subjected to futility and frustration. Not because God stopped loving His people, He never has and never will, but so we would long for His redemption. But most people chose to remain in rebellion, ruling their own lives and trying to make a name for themselves. After many generations, God sent a flood to start again with one faithful family, Noah and his wife and children, along with animals of every kind. The first of many times when God preserved a remnant for himself, gave them a promise, and showed that he prefers mercy over judgment. Even after this restart, most people went their own way. Some built a tower at Babel to exalt themselves and avoid being scattered, the opposite of God's assignment to fill the earth and steward it in partnership with him. God confused their language and spread them across the earth, separating them into many nations and cultures. And then the story turns from a world of people living their own way apart from God, without knowledge of who he is or what he is doing, to a family of faith who would receive and believe God's promises. Abraham left the false worship of his homeland in Ur and entered into a covenant with God, a binding mutual commitment that would become the basis of God's ongoing relationship with his people. God promised to bless Abraham and bless the world through his descendants, and Abraham would believe and serve God alone. Abraham went where God led him to go, into the land of Canaan, and built altars there to worship him as the one true God. Through Abraham and his family, through a long-awaited promised son, through a hope that persisted beyond all apparent hope, God would bless the world with his many descendants of faith.
Every time you're climbing a mountain, there's always excitement about getting to the summit, isn't there? The summit is where there's a sense of accomplishment, despite how hard the climb has been. It's where the reward is. The top of the mountain is where there's the scenic overlook. There's always this building excitement about getting up to the summit of the mountain. But on this mountain that I'm standing on at Mount Moriah, there was a man named Abraham who was climbing up this mountain, and every step was not met with building excitement, but rather with unspeakable dread. You heard that in the beginnings, that from all the nations, God chose one man, Abram. We would later know him as Abraham. And he told Abraham to leave his father's land and home and to go to a place that he would show him. And God made some remarkable promises to Abraham. He told him that he would give him a great name, and that from Abraham he would build a great nation, a chosen people, and that from Abraham there would be many descendants. But those promises must have been pretty perplexing to Abraham. Abraham and his wife Sarah, they were very advanced in age, and they had no kids, well beyond the age of conceiving kids. And so how could Abraham be the father of a great nation when he was the father of none? Abraham does try to take matters into his own hands, and he conceives a child with another woman, and that creates all sorts of problems, as you can imagine. It's always a dangerous thing to try to speed along the promises of God into our timelines and into our plans. But Abraham and Sarah, they do conceive a son, and they name that son Isaac. And I just imagine that in Abraham's world, like everything felt settled, fulfilled. This promise that God had given to Abraham to have a son, and there he has this son, even at an old age, and his life just must have felt complete and whole. But then God shows up in Genesis chapter 22 with instructions for Abraham to bring that son Isaac to this mountain, to Mount Moriah. Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Then take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain that I will show you." All of us have experienced the twists and turns of life that make the plans of God seem perplexing. But this is unimaginable. Not only is it unimaginable that God would ask Abraham to sacrifice his son, it makes no sense in light of the promise that God gave to Abraham. If God was going to give him the son Isaac and then through him make a great nation with many descendants, then why would he ask Abraham to give him back? This son was an important link to the raising up of a chosen people. Why is God doing this? What kind of test is this? What kind of story is this that God is writing? Abraham and his family were in Beersheba. It took them 3 days to travel there south of where I'm standing. And it's conceivable to think as Abraham approached from the south, he would have just come up the side of Mount Moriah up to the summit. They leave their servants and their donkey down below and they travel up the side. And we pick the story up in verse 6. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. Walking up the side of Mount Moriah, reading these verses, I am struck by the tension between Abraham's confidence in God's provision, yet his willingness to carry out this unspeakable act that God has asked him to do. Isaac is puzzled. In a world where child sacrifice would not have been uncommon, the carrying of the wood on Isaac's shoulders might have caused some concern for him. Every step I've taken up this mountain, I'm trying to imagine the feelings, the fears, the thoughts that Abraham must have been having. Everything in the story suggests that Abraham was willing to go through with it. We're told in the New Testament in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 19, that Abraham even reasoned that God could raise the dead if he needed to. And step by step, up Moriah, Abraham knew that he was going to the place where either God would stop him or he would kill his kid. Verse 9, when they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. This is unwavering devotion to his God. Abraham came to the brink of questioning whether his love for Isaac came before his love for God. You know, it's really easy, isn't it, to say that God comes first over everything in our life. But Mount Moriah is where that gets tested. If God wanted to bring the same test into our life, what would be the thing that he would ask us to put onto the altar? What's the thing that competes for the first place in your relationship with God? Family? Financial stability and security? Health? Status? Talent? Some possession? What is it for you? I couldn't imagine being asked to bring my 3 boys here to the side of Mount Moriah. I just couldn't imagine. What is the thing in your life that you would have to be willing to sacrifice here on Mount Moriah? What's the thing in your life that you either trust in or treasure enough to compete for unwavering devotion to your God? That question, if we will answer it honestly and it adjust our priorities, can deepen our journey with God profoundly. The story, though, continues in verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham, here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him, now that I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." So Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." So here we are on the mountain of the Lord will provide. This mountain, Mount Moriah, would later be known as Mount Zion. And it's the place where Solomon would build the temple. And it's at that temple where animals would be brought over and over to be sacrificed in the place of the sinner. And along this ridge at Moriah, there's a peak close to here where Jesus would have been led like a lamb to the slaughter, carrying wood on his shoulders to die for our sins. This mountain of the Lord where we are is the place the Lord will provide. But that story, it all started with Abraham's test. And what was Abraham's test? Do you trust God? More than anything else in this world that you might treasure or trust, do you trust in the promise and in the provision of God? And perhaps God wants to meet us on Mount Moriah with that very same question. You know, sometimes that question comes when life takes unexpected twists and we're perplexed by, God, how does all of this fit into your plan? And are there things that we've placed confidence in that we feel are starting to crumble? Did life feel complete and whole and now it's met with loss and confusion? And we have to really question, do we trust God more than we trust anything else? And sometimes that question needs to be asked when everything in life seems right and settled and fulfilled and complete. And we need to be sure that our confidence is not misplaced. And so the story begins. The story of a God who makes a promise and the story of a God who is faithful to keep it. I'll see you in a minute.
Isaac was the son of laughter, the fulfillment of the promise. On that mountain, he became an everlasting symbol of sacrificial faith and of the loving father who would sacrifice his son on a cross many years later. Abraham had waited years for the fulfillment of this promise and passed his most radical test of faith by believing God would somehow give Isaac back to him. Even though he had made mistakes, questioned the promise, and laughed at it in those long years of waiting, even though Abraham's efforts to help fulfill the promise himself had terrible consequences, God called him his friend. The testimony of his faith by later generations is that he never wavered. His faith, like ours, is judged by where it ended up, not how perfectly he handled the process. Isaac's two sons, Jacob and Esau, were rivals from the start, but it was Jacob, a deceiver and schemer, who inherited his father's blessing and the family's covenant promises. And because he did, he had to flee from his brother's wrath. He settled in his mother's homeland, married, had children, and worked hard. Over many years, after being deceived and taken advantage of several times himself, Jacob learned new ways of trusting God and fulfilling his purposes. On his return home, he found himself in an intense wrestling match with the presence of God. There, Jacob received a new name, Israel, one who strives with God and comes through it as a ruler or prince. Jacob, grandson of the father of faith, Abraham, became the father of a nation. Descendants of his 12 sons would form the 12 tribes of Israel. This family of 12 sons showed more dysfunction than most of us can imagine. Competitive mothers, turmoil between family factions, and brothers even selling one of their own. Joseph, the first son of Jacob's beloved wife Rachel, had big, God-given dreams that he would become a ruler and a deliverer. But because he was his father's favorite son, his dreams provoked his jealous brothers to sell him into slavery. After years of enduring injustice and pain in Egypt, Joseph's dreams were fulfilled. In spite of this family's deep and damaging flaws, even though the brothers' treachery against Joseph was meant for evil, God turned it into good, an enduring example of his character in redeeming the worst of our lives for his even greater purposes. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph would come to be known as Israel's patriarchs, the forefathers whose lives shaped God's chosen people. To save the living members of this patriarchal family from a famine, Joseph brought them to Egypt, a land far from God's original promises to Abraham. Yet nothing can separate God's people from his faithfulness. Even in Egypt, the promises lived on.
Mount Moriah gives us a panoramic picture of these first two movements of God's story, beginnings and patriarchs. And in the center is Mount Moriah and this question, do we believe that God will provide? Do we trust and treasure God more than anything else? You know, there are two things that you can do to help this Bible study have the greatest impact in your life. The first is there are questions that will accompany each session, and they can be used for personal reflection, or if you're watching this in a small group, you can use them for small group discussions. And I want to encourage you to take some time to answer the questions. Be authentic and open with yourself or with others. And the more that we open up our hearts to God, the more that we are giving Him an opportunity to do some work in our lives. The second thing you can do is to follow along with the Bible reading schedule that goes with each of the sessions in this series. While you're not going to read the entire Old Testament in 7 weeks with this Bible study, you'll read sections that correspond to each of the 7 sessions, and it will really help you get a panoramic view of the Old Testament. Reading the Bible for ourselves is an important part of getting the most from this study. Well, we've come to the end of session 1, and now it's your turn. Reflect and share as you answer the questions, and then get into your Bibles and read this week. Don't miss an opportunity to see how God may want to meet you on a mountain this week.